Hello, everyone. Another round of the Roundtable, Masculine Divine Masculine Roundtable. Today is super, super special for me and certainly for the brothers on the call right now. This is the first time we have a woman on the Divine Masculine Roundtable, so I'm super, super grateful for Courtney joining us. And Courtney Slobodjnak, did I say that right, Courtney?
That was beautiful.
Wow.
Awesome. Thank you. Courtney Slobodjnak is a trauma specialist. And we're going to take a deep dive here on trauma and all aspects of trauma. Brendan, do you want to add anything?
Well, I was just going to ask her some things once we get going, but I'd like to hear more about a little bit about your story and how you got started in doing what you do.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. So in my day-to-day life right now, I have a private practice where I treat specifically children from the ages of 3 to 12. And then I'm also a school-based clinician. So I'm in the elementary school. And then I do some work with early ed. So 0 to 6 year olds. I got into this work via a meandering path. So I started out in education as far as in my studies and child development, human growth, and then moved into special education work where I was seeing kids who were having a hard time in school and usually had a learning disability or some other kind of thing that they were struggling with in order to access their education. And then through that work, I realized that there, in some cases, was something that was much more than that. And wanted to ask more questions about the why and the what, and understand a little bit more about the family unit and how that impacts kids, not just in school, but in life, and certainly in those really formative years. And so I went back to school and got my master's in mental health, and then started a private practice and doing this work in schools. And through that, I realized that probably 8 out of every 10 kids that I was working with had significant trauma. And when that came about, I thought, my gosh, like I really need to hone in on my craft here and learn more about what this is, what it presents like, and then also in a kind of a, bigger circle, figure out how to help teachers and educators to understand this trauma as not just misbehavior or not wanting to do things, but really truly understanding how that was impacting these kids and also their access to their education. Yeah, I think that's the short, concise version of that.
So I was going to ask, so Courtney, how would you define trauma? Because there's many examples of trauma, and there's different spectrums of trauma, right? So,
Yes.
depending on who you are as an individual, as a character, as a soul,
Mhm.
how would you define trauma?
So this is a place where sometimes my personal spiritual path and soul are constantly trying to integrate with my professional, right, identity. Um, in a very clinical sense, I work with 3 definitions of trauma. You're right that there is like so many different people have different understandings and definitions of that. On the one hand, trauma in general to me is just a sudden, unpredictable physiological event that overwhelms your capacity to cope, manage, and regulate yourself, right? And so that could be true at any age. That could be an isolated incident or a slightly longer event. When we talk about developmental trauma, that's a little bit more complicated. But even before that, complex trauma is another definition that I work with a lot. And what that means is that it's not just one trauma, not to minimize any single trauma, but it's trauma upon trauma upon trauma that never allows the individual to regulate from that, to not ever get to that like status of coherence or regulation, um, because of their environmental factors, the people who are giving them care, those kinds of things. And then when we talk about, and so that usually indicates the repeated abuse or neglect or trauma, right? So that's complex trauma. And then when we talk about developmental trauma, that's more specific as far as kind of like complex trauma, but it usually occurs in the first 7 years of life. And the trauma is from at the hands of the primary caregiver or one of the primary caregivers. And that has just detrimental impact on that child's kind of foundational growth and development. And so those are the 3 that I would say as far as, kind of standard definitions that I use. Um, I'm excited to say that I'm in the beginning stages of writing a book about the spiritual meaning of trauma and mental illness. And so that has a very different path, right? It's asking slightly different questions, and certainly does not have a clinical answer by any means, or, you know, something that has been research proven or anything like that. But that's, another journey that's happening currently.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you see that you look out for when you're identifying trauma? I
Mm.
know children especially, they kind of express that in different ways, and sometimes it looks like they're playing and they're not playing. They're working something out.
Mhm.
They're showing you something without doing that. So what are some of the ways that you identify those things?
Mm. That's such a great question. And it's also complex to answer in some ways. If I think about that, so as a person who works with young children, right, and treats young children, play therapy is certainly something that we encounter. We dance, we move, we draw, there's art, there's sand, there's all these things. Um, but that is usually with intention, as me as the guide or facilitator of that as a practice. Um, in a preschool classroom, for instance, or any other young child classroom or environment where you're watching them play, there certainly are things that are signals or flags to indicate that there's something to be concerned about. But the one thing is that it's so individual that it's hard to pinpoint one thing, right? If you were to play with let's go old school, G.I. Joe or something, and you were using that G.I. Joe toy in a way that was kind of violent or aggressive, that could be just an expression of something. And it also could be something to be really concerned about. And so that's the part that makes it difficult, where it's not like A plus B always equals C. As a being for myself, when I go into a space and I work with kids or I'm just around people, people for me are light bodies. And so when that's the case, something that is disconnected or is not flowing right in, in their like light body self, has shadowy spots. There's like a lot of other pieces to that they certainly are. It's not teaching you in grad school or as an assessment, right? So for me personally, I'm much more having a physiological assessment just based on how I'm feeling and what I'm sensing when I'm working with somebody. Usually 99.9% of the time, even an untrained person has a physiological response to something that a child does that is concerning. And the difficulty is that many people are not listening to that, right?
Yeah.
Adults are not paying attention to that response in their gut. They're not, they're brushing it aside, maybe based on their own trauma, and or like Terrence was talking about before we got on this, a conditioning of sorts to suppress or push aside feelings, especially as men, I think, and to ignore those types of signals. So if you spend a lifetime being taught to ignore those types of things, and you're in the company of a small child and you have this response and you don't have that, muscle that you've been working all this time to notice that, pay attention to it and tune into it, then it can be missed. I think that's one of the ways that that sometimes kids get failed by adults in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't a very clear answer.
No.
But
That was a great question, Brandon and Courtney. Thank you for the response. I was going to ask the same question Brandon did, and kind of to pigtail off his question, and you kind of touched on it briefly. But like for parents or guardians with untrained eyes, not like yourself, like what do they look for? And you mentioned the physiological or psychological kind of intuitive feeling, but are there any other like telltales or something that you can give them as a tool to maybe help them be aware of their child's trauma level, if any?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a sudden change in personality, a sudden withdrawal from things that they love. There is a time period of puberty that is kind of the exception to the rule, right? There's a period of development, let's say 13 to 16, where teenagers suddenly are sleeping a lot. They don't really want to go outside anymore, and they really don't want to do the things, or they scoff at the traditions that families used to do. And so there's this period of time where they seem like they've had this major personality change because they're going through tremendous growth, and truly they are changing their personality. But so besides that time, any type of dramatic change in that way at a time when you wouldn't expect it is certainly reason in my book to ask more questions. And yeah, I recently saw this documentary called Rewind on it's on Amazon right now. And I don't, as a trauma and mental health person, don't usually watch documentaries about abuse because it's a little bit close to my daily home space, right? And if I'm watching something, I'm not necessarily looking to get deeper into that, but to maybe escape or something like that. But the reason why I watched it is because this documentary was created about a true story about a boy who experienced sexual abuse while he was young at the hands of a family member. And, but he was the actual boy of this story was the narrator, the person in the main character role of the documentary was also the producer and the director of this film.
Wow.
And so that's different for me because that is an example of somebody being able, given voice and platform to tell their story, to investigate it in their own way with people that they care about. And so that just had a completely different tone than if you were to pursue, something that was just a lot of trauma and be triggered by that or, during that watching. But he paints a really good picture of telling the story because his dad used the video camera VHS recorder at that point in time to record all these events in their lives. And you can visually see through the footage the difference between this young boy who is light and playful and, at the age of, I think, 4, something happens and it's pretty evident. He's withdrawn, he starts to get aggressive with his sister, who he otherwise loved and adored, and they were close. There's just a sudden change, feels like important to notice, to just get curious about. It doesn't always mean that there is significant abuse, but it's worthwhile as a parent, I think, to pay attention to that.
Well, I'll go through my own personal trauma. I mean, as I became whole and dealt with my childhood traumas,
Mhm.
I can tell you that your definition about something on top of another,
Mhm.
it's very real. And what I found I needed to do is withdraw because
Mhm.
the outside world wasn't safe. I mean, I'm noted here on the roundtables, I think on the first or second one, where I just said, fuck life. I just checked out. I didn't co-create with life, right? Because I didn't feel it was safe. I didn't
Right.
feel like I was empowered. And that's
Mhm.
the other thing that trauma does. It strips away your power.
Mhm.
As I whisper, as I whisper that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, reclaiming that is the other thing. The other thing that I noticed in, over the course of years as I became again whole again is that I found as I was growing up, I was responsible for other people's emotions.
Mm.
I felt responsible for other people's emotions because them reacting badly, negatively towards me created an unsafe condition. So for me, I would always be either the clown or the peacemaker and that had ramifications in my relationships in my adulthood, right? Because I never really became who I was. So there's definitely ramifications as a young boy or as a young girl, as you have these traumas and are unaware, how that then kind of bleeds into day to day as an
Mhm.
adult.
Yeah, it's so true. Um, some of the effective treatments for trauma, kind of treat the trauma like what I would describe as like a spider web that takes up root in your self. So in your brain, in your body, like all these things. And it's not until you kind of pull back the spider web of the actual event, work through it, dissolve it, move it on, whichever approach and treatment is working, that then you suddenly realize how many things that were happening through your life were tugging at the, strings of that spider web, of that thing that was kind of taking root in all these places. It can be very liberating. And I appreciate what you said, Z, about, putting yourself in a place to survive, right? To withdraw is a survival protective tactic. It's like a turtle drawing into its shell. You're like really pulling all these pieces that are potentially available for pain again into yourself to protect yourself and be surviving. I mean, the shamans have approaches of soul retrievals, because there's ways that they would describe that we take pieces of ourselves and put them aside, stash them in our pocket, leave them somewhere, because that part of ourself just couldn't exist in full color through that trauma. And so that was a preservation move, right? And we have to, in that perspective, we go back and we retrieve that piece of ourselves and then reintegrate it into who we are to become whole again.
And as you're talking, Courtney, I'm witnessing humanity's trauma as a whole, because smaller fragments of ourself make up to the big global. And what's been happening the last 10, 11, 12 months, where this is amazing self-reflection for most of us anyways. So I think by this point, you've exhausted all avenues of distractions, because more or less everything's been shut down. So you've had to reflect in some way, shape, or form. And the ability now to ask those questions and to seek answers for that. I'm just going to bookmark that now, and I think I want to speak to that a little later on.
Yeah, we haven't been able to hide from ourselves or each other through distraction during this time.
Well, and it's the other thing too that I'm reminded that one of the brothers here, Akana, had mentioned, in the way that our experiences are shaped by our mind, the ability to cognitively take it all in. The heart feels everything in. And so as we become whole, or we start going back into our innocence as we work through that, a lot of us go through therapy or some type of therapeutic process, which speaks to the mind, but very few of us talk about the heart and what hasn't been expressed. And that's what I find very interesting where we are right now, because yes, there's acrimony, yes, there's division, yes, there's hate, but these are all the stories that need to be heard. The heart's unexpressed. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think that's when I tune into the sadness or the heartbreak of the collective, that's exactly it, right? It's like if you could feel into the impact of what's underneath all of that, it's that heartbreak, right? The disappointment, the pain, the suffering, all of those things. And when there's so many of us facing those things at the same time, by the nature of where we are, that reverberation is just so huge. It's so big. And I have people and friends who are like, is today just like a really sad day? And, and that's just, there's nothing going on for them in their here and now life, but they're feeling that like well of sadness, myself included. And that's on behalf of the collective. It's not always yours, but it's also all of ours. And I would say that trauma is community property, right? Whatever we arrive into a space together holding, everybody has a part in that, even if they don't know. We're all holding that together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I work with people with trauma, usually the trauma's done, right? It's already passed. And there's layers upon layers that we have to unravel and get to. And that trauma builds beliefs on top of one another, on top of this core emotional wound that they learn to re-identify themselves through. And you have to kind of go through this relearning process of self. And it's very different from an adult. And I'm curious about what you do, especially being in a school situation, because you're limited about certain things. And then when you see something that you know is going on, there's only a point you can get to what you can't do anything more. I'm sure you come across situations that are heartbreaking because you see it occurring, you know it's happening, but you can't do anything about it. What do you do in those situations, and like how do you best help that child?
I mean, you bring up such a good point, because I think that, we have a real shortage in my area of people who work with children in this way. I could continue doing this work full time and not get to the end of it and not have people to refer kids to. And I think, when I look at this work, I think what you just described is the hardest part about it, right? When you're working with a child who is 7 and they're experiencing some trauma, if they are not yet able to describe in language what's happening, but we're both vividly aware that something is not right, they're not just about to, leave the nest. They're in this family unit for a long more time, and without evidence described to me in words and details, without marks on them, or without, even though I'm a mandated reporter and have to report, things of any suspicion of abuse at any time, sometimes that very thing is the heartbreak, is like knowing on this very deep level that something is happening, but not having anything to share or disclose, right? And that's the most difficult. That's what makes this work so hard. They're also not just one individual. They're an individual that's also part of the family unit. And so we can spend a lot of time together teaching skills, processing these things, but if they're continuing to go return to that family that's causing them harm, it's a cycle that can be exhausting, right?
Yeah.
And for me as a professional, I have very important and intentional practices, some that are self-protective, some that are processing after the fact, some are spiritual and individual, and some are debriefing and consulting, with other professionals and talking through those things, because without those processes and releases, I would probably combust, truthfully. Like it's so much heavy to hold, that without some help and support, you couldn't do it. Like you just couldn't. There was something else you said in that comment that I wanted to touch on, but I forgot. Might come back.
Okay.
So I think most of us, as we're traumatized, whether kids or adults, the incident happens, and provided there isn't further trauma, it's more about integrating that experience, or processing, maybe is a better word, that experience. I think as kids, what I'm keenly aware is kids are very resilient, and kids are very very survival driven. It's such a instinctual thing, I think, as far as living,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that means. Because I don't think they have a proper assessment depending on their age. I'm talking about 6 to 10, 11, 12, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but once that trauma is done and they've processed it the best they could in their minds, it gets encapsulated, does it not? It becomes like a little like a little like a little egg, like a little calcium egg of trauma in their bodies, and at least that's how I can describe it.
Mm-hmm.
And these are repressed memories. These are because in my head, or in my heart's expression, I couldn't rationalize, I couldn't understand what was happening at the time. Do you find that to be true? Do you
The concept of it being encased and held in this small space. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of like, I mean, I could argue that that's what tumors are made out of, right? Like physical ramifications of things that we're holding on to. And it may not be a tumor, but it could be anything, it definitely manifests itself in the body if it's not properly digested, I would say, in a very liberal sense. I think, yes, that some people do hold that in this container, compartmentalize it, and store it somewhere like that, right? That is one way to carry that with you and move forward. I would argue also that the dissolving of that, in whatever sense of the word, and the reintegration of the dissolved parts would be more ideal, right? We would be a little bit less fractured by keeping pieces of ourselves, the shadow parts included, in particular spaces. So if we were able to take that, revisit it, and give it a new shape, definition, or form in a way that was provided to us through safety, that would be ideal. But that is one way, and it's very common, is to have it in a small space. It takes a lot of bravery and courage to really look into the inner makings of something like that, right? And time. And so it's not easy, and we're maybe not super highly skilled at that yet.
Right. And I would also say that enough of these trauma incidents,
Mm-hmm.
has become more and more of a burden.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it feels heavy for some people, where
Mm-hmm.
they're living life and they're not buoyant. They're just really, really heavy.
Mm-hmm.
All these unexpressed traumas trying to get their attention to be liberated, as I like to think.
Yeah.
Now, do these memories have a trigger? Are the like if we repress these memories,
Mm-hmm.
is there a trigger that often happens?
Yes. A trigger is individual and unpredictable, right? There's a lot of sensory things: music, sound, smell, touch, reading somebody else's story. Those are the kinds of things that usually come out of what we might think is nowhere and trigger in the response of reliving something that they have repressed. And like, for instance, when my father was dying, he died very suddenly and very young. He was like 52. And I would go every day to the hospital and visit him while he was there. And there was a particular smell of this hospital that I never got out of my nose, right? And even though when my father died, we remained as close in this this life once he passed on and as connected as before, for me in my experience. And he was everywhere for me. And so it wasn't per se a trauma, right? But it was a significant loss in my life. And I found myself at another hospital, I want to say 8 years later. And that smell got into my nose. And suddenly I was right there on that one day that he died.
Wow.
And I mean, sure, like, our smells are directly, highway to the brain, right? And there's so many things, the smell of baking from when you were younger of somebody who was loving, or the smell of cigar smoke for somebody, there's things that like that can bring you in this like super fast highway right back to that moment in time. Certainly a loss is different than a trauma, but it's just a good example of what can happen. And it's not always the same thing for every person, right? The tricky part about being human is that our memories are fallible, right? Every time that we pull up a traumatic memory, there's about 2 or 3 hours, like at a time when you're really in it, there's about 2 or 3 hours of time when that happens, that there's some flexibility to that memory so that it can be influenced during that time. It can be influenced by who you are at the time you pulled it up. It can be influenced by where you are when that happens. So it can either be reinforced in the trauma, or it could be narrated in a different way, relived in a different way, given meaning to it in a different way. And then from there, reintegrated into who we are at that point. And so while repressed memory is very important, right, and it does happen and it does come up, there's also this lens that we're looking at that memory from a long time ago as, and giving it narration, essentially, as the people we are now. A good example of that is there was this family that had a number of girls, and 2 of these sisters were both sexually abused by somebody close to their family, but not their family. And the one sister would say that, like, they're both adults now. And the one sister would say that the sexual abuse was not traumatic for her because at the age that she was at, it was physically pleasing to some degree, right? The stimulation or whatever had happened was not violent or aggressive. And so the physical response was not negative per se. It wasn't until her adult brain was looking back on that time that story suddenly became concerning, right? She had a different understanding of like who that person was, what their responsibility was in the care of that, and their, and so, but that was an intellectual, mental conversation with herself when really the experience of the moment was not that traumatic. But then the sister, who also had this experience, would describe from early on until, now, or as an adult, as traumatic. That the whole thing, even if all of the actions were the same, were traumatic for her at that time in the way. And then the story is just very different. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I hear that a lot with abuse cases where because they found pleasure in it at the time, then they start to really have that guilt and that judgment of self because they knew it was wrong, but they didn't really feel it was wrong. And then they knew it was wrong later. Right?
Yeah, I mean, imagine if we judged everything that happened to us when we were young with what we know now. I mean, we do what we can do at any given point in our lives the best we can with the skills that we have and the information we have at the time, right? And so looking back on anything from 10 years ago as an adult or 25 years ago has a different lens than it did at that time. That can be helpful and it can be healing, and it can also be not so helpful because we might give it meaning that it didn't have then. Please know that I am not minimizing abuse in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, that's a serious matter, and not everybody has a nonviolent experience. But given the stage of your development, if you're in a place where that sensation would naturally be arising anyways, and you could feel guilty about having had a pleasurable experience, you know, in some situations. But was there that narrative wasn't there at the time necessarily in some cases, right? It's the narrative we gave it after.
And again, I think that's part and parcel of survival. That's part and parcel of what is required to get past, right?
Yeah.
I find it really interesting when you talked about retrieving the memory and then giving it a different narrative. I'm aware of a modality or a practice within the Tibetan community called Tibetan heart imagery. And there's a specific way. I mean, for example, I'm not talking about trauma cases like this, but more physical cases where if you got struck by a car, for example, and you got hit in the knee, well, you can go back through this heart imagery, and once you're there, relive that experience, but see a different, the car didn't hit you, the car passed you, right? And so through reliving those images, because everything is an image, the healing you wouldn't, if you had a limb, you wouldn't have a limb. If you had a tear or a crack, you would still have that, but it would be different in that way. So I find that interesting, in the power of the mind and the ability to heal. So on that note, how do you find, where do you find healing, or more correctly, how does healing begin? Is that something that is at the very, like, how does it all begin? Is it the individual that says enough is enough? Because I can imagine some of your young clients don't know anything about healing, right? They just know that they're in a space, and they don't want to be in that space. They can't even put words to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would name that simply as discomfort and more complexly as incongruence, right? There is, I mean, all beings have this desire to be whole and to be happy. And at some point when something environmental or individual or, you know, events are happening and they're keeping us from staying in our full selves, spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, and also just not able to be like in congruence with who we are, or coherence. You could use either one of those, truthfully. And so that discomfort sometimes presents itself as stress behavior, right? Sometimes presents itself as sabotaging ourselves in relationships, or, you know, there's so many ways that discomfort or incoherence could present itself. But at some point, you know, if you have a rock in your shoe, at what point do you decide, I could stop and take the rock out of my shoe, or investigate what the rock is, or ask for help if I can't get the rock out of my shoe, or, you know, and then there's also people who continue to walk in pain. I mean, that's also a choice.
But everything is a choice, is it not?
Yes. And so healing to me is, I mean, one could argue that it happens before you come into this life, right? One could argue that we have soul contracts to take on lives that are difficult because we have things to learn. And so, you know, healing is potentially all along. And I don't know that it has one singular starting place, which is kind of an annoying answer because it doesn't help, you know, clarify where to begin. I mean, even in the discomfort and the pain and the suffering that we're having, I would argue that we're healing even then, even when we haven't made any moves to remedy or relieve that suffering just yet.
I was curious if you had what the differences and similarities between working with children and working with adults through their traumas. And then on that same note, also when you are talking about how you see the auric field and you witness the trauma in the auric field, how does that look different, if at all, in a child versus the adult?
That's such a great question. For me personally, it's no different. But only because of the concept of I'm looking at people as light bodies. And so you're just a big light body or you're a small light body, right? That's, for me personally, that's the difference. And that being said, you know, adults have some level of authority over themselves. They're not specifically a part of a family unit. Obviously, everybody's part of a family unit, but they're not at the whim of their family unit. And so each adult, even if they're still the wounded, smaller version of themselves, they have this authority of being an individual, right? They're not dependent upon their mom or their dad or their grandparents or dads or moms, you know, to care for them and provide an environment to allow for that healing. And so that is one of the major differences when you're working with kids and they are part of that family unit and they are dependent about the conditions of that. Not very, you know, not easy to have them self-advocate as much in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways. And truthfully, in the idea of healing trauma, what we want is the individual to have some authority over that event that overwhelmed their system, their capacity to hold that or heal that or process it. Whether you're 5 or 29, you know, that's kind of the goal, is like having some authority, some voice over what happened to you.
Yeah.
How do you get a child to have authority over that? Something that's so traumatic, you know, how do you get them to take ownership where they can actually dismantle that for themselves?
It's way more difficult, I would say, in some ways. In other ways, you know, that first 7 years of life is the most learning that we will do over the course of our whole lifespan. Our brain is the most pliable at that time, most absorbent, most flexible, and pathways can be created more easily. And so in those first 7 years of life, I mean, this is why there's such value in early intervention, right? Because anything, learning disability, mental illness, trauma, anything that is addressed during that time has such a greater impact. It has a bigger ripple in the water. than later on. It's not impossible by any means later on. It's just different and more difficult. There's also kind of the concern about, younger children have less language, which is beautiful, and also can make it somewhat difficult when you're trying to give authority to a story about an event. So a lot of the work that I do that is the most impactful with that has nothing to do with language at all. So this is like very under the language piece, right? Whether it's with sand play therapy, there is no talking usually, and kids are working with their conscious and their subconscious and archetypal symbols and all of these things. With dance and movement therapy, it's the body and where things are holding. It doesn't mean that there has to be labels or a story told to move through those things. All of these things can be done with adults too, but it's just different as far as the medium and the kind of, weeds that you have to pull aside to get to the heart of what happened. And also the space between the event of trauma and the treatment of trauma matters, right? So if we're still in the muck of everything, then we can't see through the weeds. We can't see, like, we're in it. And so that is also a complicating factor when treating children, and also, ripe for creating tools that can be immersed into that situation at the same time. For adults, looking back is kind of flawed in that same way that, it's not flawed. It's like just another lens, like we talked about before. And yet it's all stored in the same places as it was when it occurred. And so accessing those places is the harder part. I think that's where the complexity is. Because at that point, we have created accommodations for ourselves and the wounds that we carry for so long that pathway in the brain and in the body and the muscle memory and the spirit are well trenched. It's like a path that we have walked over. There's barely any grass on it. And we definitely don't need like a machete to get through the woods of that, because we walk it all the time, right? And to change that easy to walk down path into a pathway that does need a machete, and we're like carving it out and creating a new story, new habits, all of these things, takes a lot of work and effort. And that's the part I think that makes the adult work a little bit more complex.
But as someone that has gone through that already, Courtney,
Mm-hmm.
and I can tell you everything you said about that is absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
But I got personally tired of having the same results all the time because of what I was projecting onto the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just end up with the same thing, just different ways. But you stand up. I just got tired of it.
Yeah.
The point where, like, okay, what do I need to do? Self-reflect. And yes, does take courage. Yes, it is fearful, but the rewards associated with it, especially if you didn't do it early in life, like you said, and I do agree that it has a lot of impact. But if you're here now, wherever that now is,
Mm-hmm.
20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
If you're there now and you have the tickle or the scratch to motivate, I would encourage you to do so, because there are rewards on the other side.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And it becomes, for me, it becomes my de facto thing now, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
the hero's journey is that
Mm-hmm.
treading your own path. You're in the wilderness per se, and fighting those dragons. And as we all understand, those dragons that we create, that we project, are really ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We're fighting against ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we can get away from ourselves or minimize that degree of energy, because we do expend energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm struck with collectively in the world as it's happening with this trauma, and we've all been traumatized. I think there's spectrums of trauma that people can become functional within, some are not. I'm looking at communities like the light workers or wayshores, and these individual communities are supposed to be beacons of functionality, maybe is best the way. But all I see is potentially, or in some instances, I see re-traumatizing each other, right? Because of belief systems, because certain ways have to be a certain way. There's no love and compassion with what people are enduring. So I think for us, we need to all take personal responsibility, and that urge to respond in a harsh way, draw it back, because everybody's got their cross to bear, as it were, right? That gentleness that you show for someone else, you actually create a pathway for peace and healing.
Yes.
And children are our most important resource. They're the most sacred of all beings within the human world, as far as I'm concerned. They're so special, and to have that level of trauma inflicted upon them from sexual abuse and whatever other abuse is unconscionable. So the ability to have adults clear their trauma, because trauma begets trauma, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Trauma.
Yeah, I think that's super important, right? I mean, the best possible thing that we could do as adults to help children, if that's just one way to think about it, is to do our own personal work and healing, right? Because then we are potentially at the most extreme stopping a generational trauma cycle, and at the least extreme being available and ready to help guide children in through their stages of life where they need adults who are safe and trustworthy, whether they're our children or somebody else's, right? And so as a collective, we're creating a tribe, for lack of a better word, of people who are sure-footed and whole and wise and safe and predictable. And that's what children need. And that's activism in its own way, right? We have potentially contributing to the evolution of humankind by investing in ourselves in order to be present for our children and all of the other children to come after that. Stopping generational cycles of trauma, I think, is one of the most noble things that anybody could do. Stopping the cycles of generational alcoholism or substance abuse is noble, right? It's like the most noble thing that you could do is to dig deep enough to resist or reframe your own conditioning to create an environment to give your children better than you had, which is not just for your children, it's for the next 7 generations or hundreds of generations. And there's lots of studies about epigenetics as far as like how trauma changes our DNA, and being born into a family that is maybe relatively, normal, and there isn't any abuse or substances, and it's a pretty standard story of life. But you and your DNA have the coding from your grandparents, your parents. I mean, each time that these traumas occur, it changes that DNA. And then we pass that down when we breed with somebody. It's a sterile kind of word. When we come in sacred union with somebody and create life, and then we're creating another marriage of 2 DNAs, and what has happened before matters and impacts how they enter into the world, what they have a predisposition for or a tendency of. And I'm thinking about what Brandon, you were saying before, when thinking about adults. I mean, something that I think that's really important is to know at what age a trauma occurs. Like that's a cornerstone question or a pursuit of inquiry for me, because if your person that you're talking with or working with is an adult and their trauma occurred before they had language, then the healing is not in language, right? Not that that's what you would just do anyways, but like thinking and embodying what a 3-year-old is, where they are, what is important about that developmental stage, right? Are they learning to trust? Are they learning to be slightly independent, but also reliant? Like those, the time matters as far as that goes, and how to access the most efficient kind of healing would be dependent on that, I think, because you would kind of have a sense of what they went without. Whenever a child occurs a trauma, especially in those first 7 years, to me, that's a crack in the foundation, right? If those 7 years are the foundation of what they are growing upon, right? And there's a crack or a chunk that was taken out, then every stone that is built upon that cracked foundation has some instability, right? And so getting back down there, kind of carving out what's going on, giving it some mud and spackle and helping to rebuild those foundational pieces is like the building blocks for everything that gets put on top of that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Courtney, in terms of trauma and recognizing, and forgive me, I'm losing kind of connection here in and out, so I'm missing some bits and pieces. But in terms of recognizing when the trauma took place, I mean, let's say, is that a pivotal moment that will help the healing that's to come from, building off of that trauma? Like, just in like my personal example I kind of shared earlier, it was over the course of maybe 8 years, and there wasn't this was a catalyst or a moment that I recognized it. It was just the duration of how I felt over a long period of time.
Yes, you cut out for a second there, but I think I gathered what you were asking about. The 8 years was the time frame, the longevity of that. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. I think the reason why the age becomes a cornerstone question for me is because I go into my mind about what we're doing at that time, right? So a normally developmental path has different stages of development. We have different tasks to work on, lessons to learn, things we're trying to accomplish during different stages of life. Mm-hmm. And so if we're in a particular stage, let's say that the function of this stage, I think, let's say 5 or 6, or, is about trust and fear, right? This dichotomy, like our work when we're growing during that time is trust versus fear, right? So if that's what our work is at that time and a trauma comes in, then I know there's a possibility that that person has taken a part of themselves during a very important time of development, trust versus fear, let's say, and put that part of themselves to the side, right? Or detached from a certain function or time period during that. And then I know that there's possibly missing pieces of the foundational work in the trust department, or exasperated fear, like no matter, like there's no way to calculate what it was, what the consequence was, but it kind of hones it into this area of life where this important work was interrupted, right? And so usually what that looks like in 10 years or 15 years is that they're still grappling with trust and fear because they missed those pieces. And it's definitely not irreparable. It's just honing into what's missing, what was lost during that time. And that's really through a developmental lens. It's not the only lens to look at it through, but it's just when talking about going back in time, when your memory is slightly irreliable, right, to whatever degree that is, for good or bad, that's just kind of the framework that we're all working through during that time. And so that could be potentially reliable source of assumption at the least. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question though about those 8 years.
I pieced in and out. My connection is very choppy for whatever reason today. And so I got most of it, and it did, it did for me answer what, over the time period, it made sense.
So you could use, in theory, if we're talking about yourself, right? And let's say you were talking about yourself and you were saying to yourself, gosh, between, for these 5 years, that was like a really horrible time in my life. Like it was bad. And then you could kind of use some curiosity and say, okay, if those things weren't going on during that time, what would I be otherwise reaching for, right? Is it when I was 12 and I was trying to look to somebody who is of the gender I identify as a role model to figure out how to be a man or a woman in this world, right? Was that the important work of what I was doing at that point? And is there gaps in that? Because that time I was busy surviving, not thriving and learning and growing in this really healthy way. And almost anybody can look at time frames in their life and just be curious without judgment about what they would otherwise have been doing during that time and what is the value that might be lost because you were so busy just surviving.
Courtney, I think one of the models you were bringing up is Erik Erikson's stages of development. Is that right?
Yes.
I'd love to do a deep dive on that. I think this is such a one of the modalities I personally resonated with me as I was researching my own trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe as an aside, we'll figure out a time where we can do a deep dive on that because there's fundamental core issues on those fear and trust, for example, and how those get revisited back again much later and what kind of form it takes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to do that. Of course, you willing being to do so.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite things. So I would definitely be interested in that.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think this is just sort of for me anyways. I don't know about how Terrence and Brendan feels. I think this is an introduction to get to know who you are, what you're doing, because what I'd love to do is to go into deeper aspects of this and uncover it, and even potentially give viewers tools that they can start playing with privately if they don't have the courage to go see a therapist or even having alternative therapy, because I know Brendan does amazing work with his clients. So for us here, the premise is to empower men, but it's really empower everyone to heal, because healing starts when we can heal each other, then we can stop all the cycles generational wise as well. Yeah,
it's so true. It's really just the most noble work. I mean, I think that's something that I wanted to, make sure to acknowledge. I mean, I'm so moved and inspired and humbled by the work that you all are doing just by holding these conversations. I mean, it's probably exponentially more important than you realize.
Well, and I can tell you, as we're doing this, where I am traumatized doing it. So I'm holding the space, but I'm not waning. I think this work is way too important.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that comes my way, and the perspective wise, is a gift. It's the way I choose to view it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think every brother that comes on and even holding space now, or even in the ether as we're talking, I think it's really important. I'm confident men will find these tables down the road.
Yes, me too. And it's so interesting because the imbalance that has been for so long between the masculine and the feminine within each of us, regardless of gender, and also on the spectrum of gender, the imbalance, there's almost like for a long time that those two energies have been, at odds or pitted against each other to some degree. And what a disservice to both men and women and the entire spectrum of gender, and what beautiful healing that can be created through the joining of that. And that the concept of, that we all have masculine and feminine within us, and the healthy development of one in this type of a forum reverberates and has impact on the other in all settings. And that's, why I just think this is the most important thing. And I would say, as far as men go, specifically, or people who identify as men, just being subtly aware of the fact that all humankind has come from the womb, right? And that the wounds of your mother are also part of the story that you carry forward into this world as men. And there is valuable work to be had in that. And all of us are healing the lineage of our families every time we embark on, efforts to heal anything, any parts of this. And that does go backward and forward, right? And how important that must be then for doing this.
That resonated very, very deeply with me.
Mm-hmm.
Me too.
And I'm not sure if Brendan or Terrence has any follow-up question, but it feels like the natural place for me to pause the conversation for this time around, because it's such a profound statement to be made, and I just want to make sure that we all hold that in the dignity it deserves.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a beautiful place to pause.
Yeah, that's a great end note. And nothing I could say would add any more value than that statement.
Well, I would like to say that in deep gratitude for what you're all doing, and just showing up in your most authentic self, not knowing what we don't know, right? Has it's just, yes, lots and lots of gratitude for all of you and what you're just embarking on in this journey.
Well, thank you so much for your open heart,
Yes,
your wisdom, and we look forward to having
Please.
further conversations in trauma, in all forms of trauma. I also, at this point, would like to have the viewers, as they're watching that, have any questions to, either email them to me directly on the YouTube channel that we can then start to ask questions of Courtney, or you can put them on the comment section and we'll be sure to address them further. So much love. I love you so much, Courtney. Thank you for doing this.
I love you
Thank
too.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
we'll see each
Love
other.
you all.
Take care.